Do not take that shot, Vause. That is a direct order. You are blind out there. Lieutenant Commander Miller's voice cracked through the comms, distorted by the static of the sandstorm and the roar of incoming mortar fire. The link was dying, much like the rest of Bravo team pinned down in the wadi below. Petty Officer Elena Vause did not reply. She lay prone on the jagged ridge of the limestone cliff, her body covered in dust, indistinguishable from the gray earth. The wind whipped at 50 miles per hour, tearing at her veil, but her hands were stone still. Through the scope of her SR-25, the world was a tunnel of green phosphorus and flying sand. "Echo 1, acknowledge!" Miller screamed again, his voice choked by a cough. "Fall back to the rendezvous point. You are too green for this hell. You will get us all killed." Elena exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied her lungs entirely. She ignored the blood trickling from a cut on her forehead into her left eye. She ignored the shaking ground as an RPG slammed into the rocks 10 meters below her. She was not 22 years old anymore. She was not a woman. She was physics. She was math. She adjusted the elevation turret. 2 clicks up, 1 click left for the wind shear. "Target index 1, she whispered to no one, her voice flat, devoid of fear. "RPG gunner, 600 meters. She squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. The rifle kicked against her bruised shoulder. Crack. Down in the valley, a head misted into red vapor before the rocket could leave the tube. "Target down," she whispered. 18 left. 48 hours earlier. Forward operating base, Sand Viper, border region. The heat in the Valley of Dust did not just burn, it had weight. It pressed down on the shoulders like a physical burden, heavy and suffocating. Petty Officer Elena Vause stepped off the back ramp of the C-130 Hercules, her boots sinking slightly into the shifting gravel of the tarmac. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, squinting against the harsh glare of the midday sun. Around her, the base was a hive of controlled chaos, mechanics shouting over the roar of engines, trucks rumbling toward the perimeter, and the ever-present smell of burning diesel and latrines. She looked out of place. Standing 5'4", with a frame that looked like a strong wind could knock her over, Elena did not fit the silhouette of the warriors that populated Sand Viper. Her uniform was clean, her face unweathered by the desert grit. At least not yet. "You the new attachment?" The voice was deep, laced with a gravelly irritation that matched the landscape. Elena turned to see a man towering over her. He wore the desert camouflage of the Navy SEALs, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms thick with muscle and scars. His name tape read, Miller. Elena snapped to attention, though her movements were fluid, not stiff. "Yes, sir. Petty Officer First Class Vause reporting for duty with Bravo team." Miller looked her up and down, making no attempt to hide his disdain. He didn't see the calluses on her trigger finger or the stillness in her gray eyes. He saw a girl. He saw a liability. "Vause," Miller repeated, tasting the name like spoiled milk. He turned his head and spat into the dust. "They told me I was getting a sniper. They didn't tell me I was getting a schoolgirl." 2 other SEALs behind him chuckled. They were leaning against a Humvee, cleaning their weapons with a casual arrogance that came from surviving too many firefights. "I am qualified on the SR-25 and the M1 SAS, sir," Elena said, her voice steady. She did not raise it, nor did she let it waver. "Top of my class at Scout Sniper School." "School," Miller mocked, stepping into her personal space. He smelled of tobacco and stale sweat. This isn't school, Vause. This is the Valley of Dust. The ground here eats people, especially green ones. He gestured vaguely at her clean gear. Look at you. You're too green. You squeak when you walk. Why did Command send you? Did they run out of men? Or is this some diversity quota I have to babysit? Elena felt a flash of heat rise in her neck, but she pushed it down, burying it deep in the place where she kept her fear and her anger. She had heard this before. She had heard it in training. She had heard it in selection. The only way to answer was silence and competence. I am here to do a job, sir, she said. Miller leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Then do it from the back. Stay out of my way. Don't try to be a hero. If you compromise my team, I will leave you in the desert. Do you understand me? Crystal clear, sir. Get your gear to the barracks. You bunk in the overflow tent. We don't have room for you in the main bay. Miller turned his back on her, dismissing her existence as easily as he would swat a fly. Let's go, boys. Briefing in 10. The SEALs followed him, leaving Elena standing alone on the scorching tarmac. She watched them go, her expression unchangeable. She shifted the weight of her bag, feeling the heavy, comforting outline of her rifle case against her hip. She was green. That was true. She hadn't killed a man yet. She hadn't watched a friend die in the sand. But as she looked at the jagged peaks of the mountains looming in the distance, Elena Vause knew one thing that Miller did not. Green things were the only things that survived the drought. They had deep roots. She took a breath of the hot, dusty air, tasting the metal in it. Copy that, she whispered to herself. She started walking toward the overflow tent, her steps precise and silent, leaving barely a footprint in the dust. The Tactical Operations Center was a temporary structure, a canvas tent reinforced with plywood and sandbags, smelling of stale coffee and the ozone scent of overheating electronics. Inside, the air was stagnant, churned sluggishly by a single oscillating fan that clicked rhythmically with every rotation. Lieutenant Commander Miller stood before a large plastic board, a topographic map of the Valley of Dust pinned to its surface. The map was covered in grease pencil markings, red and blue lines dissecting the beige emptiness of the terrain. The members of Bravo team sat on folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, their postures relaxed but attentive. They were big men, taking up space with an ease that suggested they owned every room they walked into. Elena Vause stood at the back, near the entrance flap. She had not been offered a chair, and she did not ask for one. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on the map. Simple reconnaissance sweep, Miller said, tapping a winding route that cut through the center of the sector. Intel suggests movement in the northern wadis. We insert here at Point Alpha, move south on foot, verify the activity, and extract at Point Bravo by 1900 hours. Low profile, no engagement unless fired upon. Standard rules of engagement apply. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his men, but his gaze slid over Elena as if she were part of the tent pole. The terrain here is tight, Miller continued, tracing a line through a narrow pass. Limestone cliffs on both sides. We will be moving through the shadow to avoid the midday heat. Elena stepped forward. The movement was slight, but in the stillness of the room, it drew attention. Sir, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly over the hum of the generators outside. Miller stopped mid-sentence. He turned slowly, the marker still pressed against the map. I am briefing, Vause. Questions come at the end. It is not a question, sir. It is an observation regarding the route. Elena walked to the map, ignoring the eye rolls from the two operators nearest to her. She pointed to the section Miller had just highlighted. This pass. The satellite imagery is 12 hours old. The wind patterns in this sector shift the dunes overnight. That entry point could be a choke point now. If we get pinned down there, the walls are too steep for a flanking maneuver. It is a classic kill zone. The room went silent. One of the SEALs, a heavy gunner named Davis, let out a short, derisive snort. Miller stared at her finger on the map, then up at her face. His expression was one of exaggerated patience, the kind a parent uses with a slow child. "Vause, do you know how many operations I have run in this valley?" Miller asked. "I do not know the exact number, sir." 34, Miller said. "I know this dirt better than I know my own driveway. Those walls provide cover, not a trap. If we go over the ridge like you are suggesting, we silhouette ourselves against the skyline. We would be targets for every sniper within 2 miles. "Not with the storm coming in," Elena countered. She did not back down. "Barometric pressure is dropping. A magnetic storm will kill the visibility and the comms. If we are in the low ground when that hits, we are blind and deaf. On the ridge, we maintain the signal longer." Miller dropped the marker on the tray. The sound was sharp, like a pistol crack. "There is no storm in the forecast, Vause. Meteorology cleared us for a 24-hour window." He stepped closer to her, using his height to intimidate. "You are looking for ghosts because you are scared. That is natural. You are green, but do not confuse your fear with tactical insight." He turned back to the team. "Davis, you take point. Rodriguez, heavy weapons. Vause." He paused, a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "You take rear guard. Stay 20 meters back. Watch our 6, and try not to get lost." "Sir," Elena said, her jaw tightening. "If the storm hits..." "Enough," Miller snapped. "That is a direct order. You are rear security. You carry the extra radio batteries and you keep your mouth shut unless you see a target. Are we clear?" Elena looked at the map one last time. She saw the choke point. She saw the perfect L-shape ambush site that the terrain naturally formed. She saw the disaster waiting to happen. But she also saw the wall in Miller's eyes. "Clear, sir," she said. "Good. Wheels up in 30 minutes. Gear up." The meeting broke up with the scraping of chairs and the zipping of Velcro. The men moved past her, clapping each other on the shoulders, already joking about what they would eat when they got back. Elena stood alone for a moment longer, staring at the red line on the map that led straight into the dark heart of the valley. She felt a cold knot in her stomach, the intuition of a hunter who senses a change in the wind before the prey does. They were walking into a trap, and she was the only one who could see the teeth. She turned and walked out into the blinding sun to check her rifle scope one last time. If they wouldn't listen to her words, she had to make sure they could rely on her aim. The insertion vehicle, a dusty, mine-resistant, ambush-protected MRAP truck, groaned as it navigated the rocky debris field before coming to a halt. The hydraulic hiss of the rear ramp lowering was the last mechanical sound they would hear for hours. Outside, the valley of dust waited, silent and baking under a white-hot sky. "Move out. Spacing 5 meters. Miller's voice came over the internal comms, crisp and devoid of emotion. Elena stepped out last, the transition from the air-conditioned cabin to the desert air hitting her like a physical blow. The temperature was pushing 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a dry heat that evaporated sweat before it could even bead on the skin, leaving behind a crust of salt and grit. The team formed up instantly, a single file line of lethal efficiency moving into the canyon. Elena took her position at the rear, the tail gunner. She adjusted the shoulder straps of her rucksack. Between her SR-25 rifle, the plate carrier, ammunition, water, and the extra radio batteries Miller had assigned to her, she was carrying nearly 70 pounds of gear, almost half her body weight. The march began. For the first hour, the adrenaline kept the fatigue at bay. But as the terrain shifted from flat gravel to inclining shale, the physical reality of the mission set in. The seals in front of her were giants. Their natural stride was long and powerful, eating up the ground with an effortless rhythm. For every step they took, Elena had to take 1.5. She had to maintain a near jog just to keep the 5-meter gap from widening into 10. Dust kicked up by the boots in front of her coated her throat. She could taste the limestone. Her thighs began to burn, a dull ache that promised to turn into sharp agony if she stopped moving. But she did not stop. She fixed her eyes on the back of the man in front of her, Rodriguez, the heavy weapons specialist, and matched his pace, refusing to let the distance grow by even an inch. "You breathing heavy back there, Echo?" Rodriguez's voice crackled in her earpiece. It wasn't concern. It was amusement. Elena checked her breathing. It was controlled, rhythmic, in through the nose, out through the mouth. "Negative," she replied, her voice flat. "Just admiring the view." "Keep the chatter down," Miller snapped from the front. They pushed deeper into the valley. The walls of the canyon rose higher, jagged teeth of rock that blocked out the horizon. The silence here was unnatural. There were no birds, no wind, just the crunch of boots on stone and the heavy rhythmic sound of their own respiration. As they reached a particularly steep incline of loose scree, Elena's boot slipped. She slid back a foot, gravel cascading down the slope, before she dug her toe in and regained her balance. It was a minor stumble, a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Davis, the point man who had circled back to check the formation, paused as he passed her. He looked at her sweating face, then at the oversized rifle case strapped to her back. "Load looks heavy for a little thing," Davis whispered as he passed. His voice low enough to stay off the main comms, but loud enough for her to hear. He reached out a hand, gesturing to her rifle. "Want me to carry the big gun for you, sweetheart? You can carry my canteen." It was a test. It was always a test. If she said yes, she admitted she was weak. If she got angry, she admitted she was emotional. Elena looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his eyes behind his ballistic sunglasses. She didn't slow down. She shifted her weight forward, driving her boots harder into the loose rock. "Focus on your sector, Davis," she said, her voice barely a whisper, cold as liquid nitrogen. "My rifle stays with me. Worry about your own 0. Davis chuckled, a dry sound, and turned back to the front. "Suit yourself. Just don't pass out." They crested the ridge and descended into the shadowed floor of the next wadi. Elena felt the muscles in her lower back spasm, a sharp protest against the weight, but she locked it away in a mental box. Pain was just information. It told her she was still alive. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows against the canyon walls. The air grew heavier, charged with static electricity. Elena glanced at the sky. The horizon, previously a clear blue, was now tinged with a sickly yellow bruise. The storm she had predicted was forming, gathering its strength miles away, invisible to the naked eye, but palpable to the skin. She scanned the high ground, her eyes moving in a grid pattern across the cliffs above them. Nothing moved, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up. It was the feeling of being watched, the primal instinct of prey sensing a predator in the tall grass. She gripped her rifle tighter. They were deep in the throat of the valley now, and the jaws were beginning to close. "Miller," she whispered into her mic, breaking protocol. "I have a bad feeling about the ridgeline at 3 o'clock. "Maintain silence, Vause," Miller replied instantly. "Keep moving." Elena kept moving, but her finger slid from the trigger guard to rest gently on the safety. The column halted. Miller raised a fist, signaling a short security stop. The team dropped to one knee in unison, weapons facing outward, scanning their respective sectors. Elena exhaled slowly, lowering her heart rate. She brought the SR-25 up, settling the heavy rifle on a flat rock to stabilize her aim. Through the high magnification optic, the valley floor jumped into sharp relief. To the untrained eye, it was just a chaotic jumble of shale, limestone, and dead scrub brush. But to a sniper, the landscape was a text to be read. She scanned the ridgeline 400 meters to their left. Nothing. She panned down to the scree slope at the base of the cliffs. "Stop." She held her breath. Her crosshairs hovered over a patch of loose gravel, about 200 meters ahead of their position. It was subtle, almost invisible. A single stone, no larger than a fist, had been overturned. The top was gray, covered in the patina of centuries of exposure, but the underside, now facing up, was a slightly darker shade of ochre. It had not been bleached by the sun yet. Someone or something had stepped there recently. Elena widened her focus. A few meters further up, she saw a broken twig on a dried bush. The break was jagged and white, fresh. "Nature is random," her instructor at Quantico had drilled into her. "Man is clumsy. Man leaves lines." She was looking at a line. It was faint, dusted over by the wind. But it was there. A path leading up into the rocks, parallel to their own route. Her finger tapped against the receiver of her rifle. The internal debate was agonizing. If she called this in, and it turned out to be nothing, a mountain goat, a rock slide, Miller would have the ammunition he needed to wash her out. The girl is seeing things. She is cracking under the heat. But if she stayed silent, and it was a spotter. She keyed her radio, shielding her mouth with her hand to dampen the sound. "Bravo 1, this is Echo," she whispered. Her voice was steady, stripping away all doubt. "I have visual indicators of recent movement at bearing 290. Displaced rock and broken vegetation. Approximately 2 hours old." The silence on the comms stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. She could see Miller at the front of the column. He didn't even turn his head. "Echo, copy," Miller's voice came back, flat and uninterested. "We are in a game trail area. Goats move through here to the upper pastures. Sir, the displacement suggests a heavy tread. A boot, not a hoof. And the breakage height is waist level." "Vause," Miller cut in, his tone dropping an octave. "We are on a timeline. The sensors show no thermal signatures in that sector. You are looking at shadows. Focus on your rear arc. Do not clog the net with speculation. Break." The line clicked dead. Elena stared at the radio handset, then back through her scope. The thermal sensors wouldn't pick up a man covered in a thermal blanket, or someone hiding in a cave mouth where the ambient temperature matched their body heat. Technology had blind spots. Eyes did not. She lowered the rifle, a cold dread settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the MRE she had eaten earlier. She looked around. The valley was too quiet. Even in the desert, there was usually life. Lizards skittering on rocks, insects buzzing, hawks circling the thermals. Today, the sky was empty. The ground was still. The animals knew something was coming. "Moving!" came the command. The team rose and continued the trudge. Elena forced herself to stand, her legs heavy. She kept looking back at the ridge where she had seen the signs. She felt the weight of 19 sets of eyes on her back. Not her team, but the invisible enemy she knew was there. As they rounded the bend of the canyon, the light began to change. The harsh, brilliant white of the afternoon sun was being swallowed. To the west, the horizon had vanished. In its place was a wall. It wasn't a cloud. It was a solid, towering mass of earth and wind, stretching from the ground to the heavens. The color was a sickly, bruised yellow, churning like boiling soup. The wind picked up instantly, shifting from a breeze to a steady, moaning gale that whipped sand against their goggles. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in a minute. Elena checked her GPS unit on her wrist. The screen flickered, the numbers jumping erratically before freezing. The magnetic interference from the storm front was already hitting them. "Bravo 1, she whispered to herself, not bothering to key the mic this time. "We are out of time." The shadow of the storm fell over them, turning day into an eerie twilight. The trap was not just set. The door had just been slammed shut. The storm did not arrive. It collided with them. One moment, there was a distinguishable delineation between the sky and the earth. The next, there was only a wall of churning ochre. The wind hit with the force of a physical assault, a solid hammer of air moving at 60 miles per hour. It carried millions of microscopic razors, silica and limestone dust that scoured exposed skin and found its way into every sealed crevice of their gear. "Masks up! Goggles down! Now!" Miller's shout was barely audible over the roaring locomotive sound of the gale. Elena pulled her shemagh tight across her face, sealing the edges of her ballistic goggles. The world instantly shrank to a claustrophobic sphere of swirling brown. Visibility dropped from 200 meters to 50, then to 10, and finally to the length of a rifle barrel. The team bunched up, the 5-meter spacing collapsing out of necessity. If you couldn't see the man in front of you, he didn't exist. Elena glanced at her wrist GPS. The screen was awash in static lines, the satellite lock indicator blinking a frantic, useless red. She looked through her night vision monocular, hoping the thermal overlay would cut through the dust. It was useless. The friction of the sand particles created a wall of thermal noise, washing out the sensors in a uniform gray fuzz. The million-dollar technology of the United States Navy was effectively blind. They were fighting the desert now, and the desert was winning. "Hold position!" Miller's voice crackled in her earpiece, broken by heavy static. "Radio check. Bravo 2, report." "Static. Heavy interference," came the garbled reply from Davis. "Command, this is Bravo Actual," Miller yelled, his frustration palpable even through the distortion. "We are experiencing severe brownout conditions. Requesting vector to extraction. Over." Only the hiss of white noise answered him. The magnetic storm had ionized the atmosphere, scattering the radio waves like leaves in a hurricane. They were cut off. No drones, no air support, no extraction. Elena sank to one knee near a limestone outcrop, using the rock as a partial windbreak. She shielded the action of her rifle with her body. While the others were fiddling with their radios, tapping screens and cursing the lack of signal, she was listening. She closed her eyes for a second. The wind howled, a banshee scream that covered everything. But underneath that, there was a rhythm to the chaos. The sand didn't just blow, it flowed, and flows could be disrupted. She felt a strange calmness settle over her. This was the equalizer. The SEALs relied on their situational awareness, their superior optics, their real-time intel. Without it, they were agitated, their movements jerky and tense. But Elena had spent her childhood hunting in the dense pine forests where visibility was a luxury. She knew how to be still when the world was moving. "We hunker down here," Miller signaled with a hand motion, realizing verbal comms were becoming impossible. "Defensive perimeter, 360 degrees. We waited out." The men scrambled to find cover among the rocks, their silhouettes ghostly and indistinct in the gloom. They were looking inward, checking their gear, wiping dust from their lenses. Elena turned outward. She stared into the void of the storm. The wind was blowing from the north, pushing the dust into their faces. Any attack would come with the wind, using the dust as a screen. She wiped her scope lens with a thumb, though she knew it would be coated again in seconds. She didn't need to see clearly to know they were there. The goats Miller had dismissed, the broken twig, the shifted stone. The enemy had been waiting for this weather. They knew the valley. They knew the Americans would be blind. Her heart rate slowed. Thump, thump. Then a sound cut through the roaring wind. It was distinct, sharp, and unmistakably artificial. It wasn't the dull thud of a rock falling. It was the supersonic crack of a bullet breaking the sound barrier. Snap. 10 feet to her right, sparks flew from the rock face where Miller was leaning. "Contact!" Davis screamed, his voice tearing through the confusion. But the warning came too late. The darkness erupted with muzzle flashes, not from one direction, but from two. The trap had sprung. The ambush did not unfold in stages. It detonated. The air around them snapped and hissed as hundreds of rounds poured into the kill zone from two converging angles. The classic L-shaped ambush was a geometry of death, designed to trap a unit in a crossfire where there was no cover, only exposure. The enemy was positioned on the high ridges to the north and the east, firing down into the bowl where Bravo team had taken shelter. "Contact front! Contact right!" Miller roared, his voice straining against the cacophony. He raised his rifle, firing a burst into the swirling dust, but there was no target to hit. Just flashes of muzzle fire blinking like strobe lights in a nightclub from hell. The return fire was overwhelming. Rounds sparked off the rocks, sending razor-sharp fragments of limestone spraying into their faces. "Man down! I have a man down!" screamed Rodriguez. To Elena's left, Petty Officer Jenkins, the team's medic, was thrown backward as if yanked by an invisible cable. A round had punched through his shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. Before anyone could move to drag him to cover, a mortar round whistled in. It didn't shriek, it sighed. A soft thump followed by a concussive blast that sucked the air out of Elena's lungs. The explosion landed 10 meters from the center of their perimeter. The shockwave lifted Elena off the ground and slammed her back down, her ears ringing with a high-pitched tone that drowned out the wind. She tasted blood, her own. She shook her head, forcing her eyes to focus through the dust that was now thick with the acrid, metallic stench of cordite and pulverized rock. Through the haze, she saw Miller. The team leader was trying to stand, to rally his men, but his right leg buckled underneath him. A jagged piece of shrapnel from the mortar casing had torn through his thigh. He collapsed, clutching the wound, his face a mask of agony and rage. "Suppressive fire! Get some rounds downrange!" Miller yelled from the ground, his voice wet and ragged. The SEALs responded with the ferocity of trapped animals. Their saws and carbines opened up, chewing through ammunition belts. But they were firing blind. They were shooting at ghosts in a sandstorm, while the enemy above had pre-sighted every rock and crevice in the wadi. Elena pressed herself flat against the earth, making herself as small as possible. A bullet struck the ground inches from her helmet, kicking dirt into her eyes. She didn't fire. Not yet. Her SR-25 was a precision instrument, not a machine gun. In this chaos, a single unmasked shot would reveal her position, and she would be dead in seconds. She watched the geometry of the fight. It was a slaughter. The enemy had them pinned against the sheer face of the canyon wall. They couldn't move forward because of the heavy machine gun fire from the north. They couldn't retreat because of the snipers on the eastern ridge. They were being herded, held in place for the mortars to finish them off. "We can't stay here," Davis yelled, dragging the wounded Jenkins behind a boulder. "We're sitting ducks, boss." "Hold the line," Miller gritted out, tightening a tourniquet around his own leg with trembling hands. "Command is blind. We have to fight our way out." But Elena knew they couldn't. Not like this. The volume of fire was too intense. The enemy had superior numbers, superior position, and the weather on their side. Every second they stayed in the kill zone was a second closer to extinction. Panic began to fray the edges of the team's discipline. She could see it in the way they flinched at every near miss, in the wildness of their return fire. They were elite warriors, but they were human, and they were dying. Elena looked up. Through a momentary break in the dust, she saw it. To the west, a narrow goat path wound its way up the cliff face. It was steep, exposed, and treacherous, but it led to a jagged spire of rock that overlooked the enemy's flank. If someone could get up there. If someone could see above the dust. She looked at Miller, who was bleeding into the sand, shouting orders into a dead radio. She looked at the men who had laughed at her, now pinned and bleeding. The choice was simple physics. Stay and die, or move and likely die. She checked her magazine. 19 rounds remaining in the mag. 2 spare mags. Elena Vause took a deep breath, inhaling the dust and the death. She wasn't green anymore. She was the only option left. The logic of the battlefield was cruel, but it was absolute. Elena lay prone behind a slab of limestone, the dust swirling around her like a shroud, and ran the calculations. The enemy had the high ground. They had the numbers. They had the initiative. Bravo team was currently a stationary target in a shooting gallery, and the laws of probability dictated that within 10 minutes, the mortar fire would walk its way into the center of their formation and turn them all into pink mist. There was only one variable that could change the equation: a new angle. She shifted her gaze upward, squinting through the stinging grit. To the west, rising like a jagged spine against the darkened sky, was a solitary pinnacle of rock. It stood about 300 feet above the wadi floor. From that vantage point, a shooter would have a clear line of sight across the entire ambush line. But getting there was suicide. The path was a goat trail, exposed and crumbling, scoured by the 60-mile-per-hour winds. Elena looked back at the team. Miller was still shouting, his face pale under the grime, trying to coordinate fire that was hitting nothing but rock. Davis was dragging ammo cans to the heavy gunner. They were fighting hard, but they were fighting a losing battle. They were hammers trying to hit smoke. They needed a scalpel. She reached down to her chest rig. Her fingers, steady and precise, found the quick-release buckles of her rucksack. Click, click. The heavy pack, filled with extra batteries, rations, and the survival gear Miller had insisted she carry, slid off her shoulders. The sudden weightlessness was jarring. For the first time in 2 days, she felt light. She felt fast. She checked her loadout. Her SR-25 with the suppressed barrel. 3 magazines in her vest, 1 in the rifle. Her sidearm. A combat knife. That was it. She was stripping herself down to the barest essentials of her function. She began to crawl backward, moving away from the safety of the rock, away from the team. Vause! The shout barely cut through the wind. She paused and looked back. Miller had pulled himself up to a sitting position against a boulder. He was looking straight at her. His eyes were wide, filled with pain and a sudden, furious disbelief. He saw her dropped pack. He saw her crawling away from the perimeter, retreating into the storm while the rest of them held the line. He didn't see a tactical maneuver. He saw a green kid breaking under pressure. He saw cowardice. Vause, get back in formation, Miller screamed, his voice raw. Where the hell are you going? Elena didn't answer. She couldn't explain the geometry of the kill zone to him over the roar of the wind, and she didn't have the time to argue. Every second she wasted was another chance for a mortar to land on them. She met his gaze for one brief second. In that look, she didn't offer an apology. She offered a goodbye. Then she turned her face into the wind and scrambled into the dust. Vause, that is a direct order. Miller's voice faded behind her, swallowed by the cacophony of battle. She was alone now. The noise of the firefight began to recede, replaced by the solitary howl of the storm. She moved low and fast, crab-walking over the loose shale until she reached the base of the western cliff. The path loomed above her, a terrifyingly narrow ribbon of stone clinging to the precipice. The wind buffeted her body, threatening to peel her off the rock face before she even started. Elena slung her rifle across her back, tightening the strap so it wouldn't bang against the stone. She chalked her hands with dust from the ground, gripped the first handhold, and pulled. She wasn't Petty Officer Vause anymore. She wasn't the green attachment. She was just a mechanism of elevation and windage. She began the climb, ascending into the blind white heart of the storm, leaving her humanity at the bottom of the cliff. The rock face was cold, a stark contrast to the burning air that swirled around it. Elena pressed her cheek against the limestone, her fingers clawing into a narrow fissure filled with grit. The wind here was not just a force, it was a physical presence, shoving against her back, trying to pry her off the wall and send her plummeting 300 feet to the canyon floor. She moved with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of a creature that knew one mistake meant extinction. 3 points of contact always. Hand, hand, foot. Test the hold. Move. Hand, foot, foot. Test the hold. Move. The SR-25 strapped to her back felt like an anchor. Every time the wind gusted, the rifle acted as a sail, catching the air and twisting her center of gravity. The strap dug into her shoulder, cutting off circulation, but she welcomed the pain. Pain was focus. Pain meant she was still attached to the world. Below her, the battle was a muffled roar. The acoustics of the canyon distorted the sounds, turning the sharp cracks of gunfire into a dull, continuous rolling thunder. She didn't look down. Looking down was for people who had a choice. 50 feet from the summit, the rock became slick with deposited silica. Her right boot slipped, scraping uselessly against the stone. For a heart-stopping second, she hung by her fingertips, her body swinging out over the void. Her breath hitched, a sharp gasp that tasted of copper and dust. She slammed her boot back into the crevice, jamming the toe in until the rubber bit into the rock. She exhaled, a long, shuddering release. "You are not a girl," she told herself. "You are a system of levers and pulleys. Elevate." She reached for the next hold. Suddenly, a sharp ping rang out next to her ear, followed instantly by the sting of rock fragments spraying against her neck. A stray round from the firefight below had ricocheted off the cliff face, inches from her head. The impact vibrated through the stone and into her fingertips. The shockwave rattled her teeth. Elena froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The instinct to curl into a ball, to press herself flat and hide, was overwhelming. But there was nowhere to hide. She was exposed on a vertical tombstone. She closed her eyes for a microsecond. If I stop, I die. If I fall, I die. The only way out is up. She opened her eyes. The fear was still there, but she pushed it behind a wall of cold necessity. She moved faster now, abandoning caution for momentum. Hand over hand, driving her legs like pistons, she clawed her way up the final stretch of the chimney. Her fingers found the lip of the ridge. With a guttural grunt of effort, she hauled herself up and over the edge, rolling onto the flat plateau of the summit. She lay there for a moment, chest heaving, staring up at the yellow-brown sky. The wind here was ferocious, screaming across the exposed rock, but she was solid. She was stable. Elena didn't rest. She crawled forward on her elbows, moving like a lizard, until she reached the precipice overlooking the valley. She unslung her rifle, extending the bipod legs and settling the stock into the pocket of her shoulder. She wiped the dust from her scope lens with a gloved thumb and pressed her eye to the optic. The world below transformed. The chaos of the ambush, which had been a confusing blur from the ground, laid itself out before her with terrifying clarity. She saw the L shape of the enemy positions. She saw the machine gun nest pinning her team. She saw the mortar crew adjusting their tube. And she saw the Bravo team, huddled and desperate, unaware that the angel of death had just taken her perch above them. She was no longer Elena. She was Echo, and she had the high ground. The comms earpiece in Elena's left ear crackled, a jagged burst of static that morphed into a familiar, desperate voice. "Do not take that shot, Vause. That is a direct order. You are blind out there." Lieutenant Commander Miller's voice was distorted, not just by the atmospheric interference of the magnetic storm, but by the raw panic of a commander watching his unit disintegrate. From his perspective at the bottom of the kill zone, Elena had abandoned them. He thought she was fleeing. He didn't know she was hunting. Elena did not reply. The time for conversation had ended 10 minutes ago at the bottom of the cliff. She lay prone on the jagged ridge, her body fused with the gray limestone. The wind whipped at 50 miles per hour, tearing at the fabric of her uniform, snapping the loose ends of her veil like whip cracks. But inside the bubble of her focus, there was only silence. Through the scope of her SR-25, the valley floor was a surreal painting of swirling ochre dust and green tracer fire. She dialed the magnification up to 10x. The optics cut through the gloom just enough to reveal the enemy positions on the opposite ridge. They were confident. They were standing tall, silhouetted against the rocks, firing down at the trapped Americans with the impunity of executioners. Elena scanned the line. Her eyes skipped over the riflemen. They were annoying, but not fatal. She needed the heavy hitters. There. 600 meters away, perched on a limestone shelf, a figure knelt. He was shouldering a dark tube, an RPG-7. The warhead was already loaded, pointing down into the bowl where Bravo Team was pinned. "Echo 1, acknowledge," Miller screamed again, a cough racking his voice. "Fall back to the rendezvous point. You are too green for this hell. You will get us all killed." Elena exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied her lungs entirely, creating a momentary vacuum of stillness within her ribcage. She ignored the blood trickling from a cut on her forehead into her left eye. She ignored the shaking ground as a mortar round slammed into the rocks 10 meters below her perch. She was not 22 years old anymore. She was not a woman. She was not green. She was a biological ballistics computer. She looked at the wind flags she didn't have, the bending scrub brush, the angle of the falling dust. Full value wind from left to right. Strong, inconsistent. She reached up and adjusted the elevation turret. Click, click. 2 clicks up. Then the windage. This was the gamble. If she misjudged the gust, the bullet would drift 3 feet to the right and strike the rock, alerting every gunner on the ridge to her position. 1 click left. She held Kentucky windage for another half-mile. "Target index 1, she whispered to no one, her voice flat, devoid of fear. "RPG gunner, 600 meters. The crosshairs settled on the center of the man's chest. The wind gusted, shaking her bipod. She waited. Patience was the weapon. The bullet was just the delivery system. The gust died down. The world paused. She squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. It was a surprise break, just as she had been taught. The rifle kicked against her bruised shoulder, the suppressed crack lost in the howling gale. The flight time was less than a second, but it felt like a lifetime. Down on the opposing ridge, the RPG gunner's head snapped back. A mist of red vapor atomized in the wind. The launcher slipped from his hands, firing harmlessly into the sky as he collapsed backward over the rocks. "Target down," she whispered, cycling the bolt with a smooth mechanical motion. A hot brass casing spun out and landed in the dust next to her cheek. 18 left. The enemy line didn't react immediately. In the noise and chaos, they hadn't realized that the hand of God had just reached down and plucked one of them from existence. They thought it was a stray bullet. Elena shifted her aim. The game had changed. The hunters were about to become the prey. Confusion is a weapon, and Elena Vause wielded it with surgical precision. After the RPG gunner fell, there was a 3-second pause in the enemy's rhythm. The heavy machine gun on the north ridge stuttered, the gunner hesitating as he saw his comrade crumple without an audible gunshot. In that hesitation, Elena found her next mark. A man in a dark tunic was standing behind the machine gun nest, waving his arm, pointing down at the seals. He was shouting, his mouth wide open, rallying his men to press the attack. A leader. Elena shifted the crosshairs 3 mils to the left. She didn't think about his rank, his family, or his politics. To her, he was a collection of geometry and physics. He was target number 2. She exhaled. The trigger broke. The leader dropped mid-shout, struck centrally in the chest. 2. she whispered. She cycled the bolt. Clack, clack. The sound was rhythmic, mechanical, a metronome counting down the remaining seconds of the enemy's advantage. Now, panic began to set in on the ridge. The fighters realized this wasn't random fire. They were being picked off. Two men scrambled toward the fallen leader, not to help him, but to grab the radio handset he had dropped. Elena waited. She let the first man reach the radio. As he lifted it to his ear to call for reinforcements, she fired. The round took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind the rocks. The radio shattered. 3. She didn't stay still. The golden rule of sniping was shoot and move, but on this narrow, exposed spire, movement was limited. She couldn't relocate to a new position, so she made micro-adjustments. She rolled slightly to her right, shifting her angle through a gap in the limestone shards. It wasn't much, but it changed the vector of the muzzle flash just enough to confuse anyone looking for her. Below, the dynamic of the battle was shifting. The suppressive fire that had been pinning Bravo team was becoming sporadic. The enemy gunners were no longer focused solely on killing the Americans. They were flinching, glancing over their shoulders, scanning the high cliffs with terrified eyes. They knew there was a wolf in the mountains, but the dust storm hid its teeth. Elena entered the flow state. It was a mental space she had only touched briefly in training, a place where the conscious mind receded and muscle memory took the wheel. The screaming wind faded into background white noise. The pain in her bleeding fingers dulled. There was only the scope, the reticle, and the target. She saw a sniper on the opposing ridge trying to set up a shot. He was good, using a camouflage net to break up his outline, but he moved too fast. Crack. 4. A heavy machine gunner tried to traverse his weapon toward her probable position, spraying rounds blindly into the cliff face 50 feet below her. Limestone exploded into dust clouds. He was guessing. Elena didn't guess. She waited for the recoil of his gun to settle, waited for the split second his head appeared above the shield. Crack. 5. Down in the wadi, the change was palpable. The air, previously thick with the swarm of incoming lead, began to clear. Lieutenant Commander Miller, his leg bound with a tourniquet, stopped shouting into the dead radio. He pressed his back against the rock, listening. He heard the rhythm. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly consistent. Crack, pause, crack, pause, crack. It wasn't the rapid, panicked fire of a firefight. It was the steady, rhythmic drumbeat of an execution. Miller looked up at the cliff face, shrouded in the swirling yellow dust. He couldn't see her. He couldn't see anything but the storm. But he knew that cadence. He looked at Davis, who was bandaging, another SEAL. "Someone is up there," Davis rasped, his eyes wide. "Someone is cleaning house." Miller swallowed the copper taste in his mouth. He remembered the small, quiet girl he had ordered to carry the batteries. He remembered telling her she was too green to be of use. "Echo," Miller whispered, the realization hitting him harder than the shrapnel. "It's Echo." Elena didn't hear them. She didn't feel the shift in momentum. She only saw the next variable in the equation. "Target-rich environment," she murmured, her eye never leaving the glass. 6. The rhythm of the kill zone was broken not by a sound, but by a feeling. It was a prickle on the back of the neck, a sudden, cold certainty that the observer had become the observed. Elena stopped scanning the valley floor. She froze, pulling her rifle tight into her shoulder, her breathing arrested in her throat. Below, the enemy infantry was in disarray, but up here, in the high jagged peaks of the canyon, a different game was being played. She slowly traversed her scope to the opposite ridge, searching the deep shadows of the limestone crevices. The dust storm was thickening, turning the air into a soup of brown particulate matter, but even the storm could not hide everything. There. It was faint, a momentary anomaly in the swirling chaos, a flash of glass. Not a reflection of the sun. The sun was dead behind the clouds, but a reflection of the ambient light catching a curved lens. It was a scope. He was hunting her. Before she could react, the rock 6 inches to the right of her face exploded. Crack! The sound of the bullet impact arrived a split second before the sound of the gunshot. Sharp fragments of stone sprayed into Elena's cheek, cutting the skin. Dust filled her right eye, blinding her momentarily. She flinched, instinctively rolling back from the ledge, pressing herself flat into the depression of the plateau. Her heart hammered against the cold ground. That was a Dragunov SVD. The round was a 7.62 by 54 OSR. He had missed her by the width of a hand. The wind had saved her. She lay still, tasting the copper of her own blood and the grit of the mountain. She couldn't stay here. He had her range. He had her elevation. He was adjusting his windage right now. If she peeked over the same spot, she was dead. But she couldn't leave. If she retreated, he would have free rein to pick off Miller and the rest of Bravo team below. It was a duel. High noon in the middle of a sandstorm. Elena reached into her vest and pulled out her spare shemagh, the desert scarf she used to clean her optics. She balled it up, shaping it roughly into the size of a human head. It was a crude decoy, but in this visibility, silhouette was everything. She crawled 5 feet to her left, moving slowly to avoid kicking up dust. She found a small fissure in the rocks, just wide enough to slide the barrel of the SR-25 through. She positioned the rifle, settling the bipod legs into the dirt. She didn't look through the scope yet. With her left hand, she reached out with a long piece of deadwood she had found near the cliff edge. She hooked the balled-up scarf onto the end of the stick. She took a deep breath. This was the gamble. If he was disciplined, he would wait for a face. If he was eager, he would shoot at movement. "Come on," she whispered. She slowly raised the stick, lifting the scarf just above the rock line, 10 feet away from her actual position. She moved it slightly, mimicking the head movement of a spotter trying to acquire a target. Bang! The shot was immediate. The scarf was ripped from the stick, shredded by the heavy round. In that same instant, Elena saw it. A distinct, star-shaped muzzle flash, blooming from a shadowed overhang on the opposing ridge, 400 yards away. She didn't need to search anymore. She knew exactly where he was. She pressed her eye to the scope. The ghost image of the muzzle flash was burned into her retina. She centered her crosshairs on the dark void beneath the overhang. She couldn't see his body, but she knew the geometry. He was prone. He was cycling his bolt. He thought he had killed her. "Windage. Half mil left," she murmured. She didn't hesitate. She fired. The SR-25 bucked. The suppressed shot hissed through the air. Through the scope, she saw the impact. It wasn't on rock. It was a soft impact. A body slumped forward out of the shadows, tumbling slightly down the scree slope before coming to a stop. The Dragunov rifle clattered down after him. Elena didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She simply worked the bolt of her rifle, chambering a fresh round. Her hands were steady, though her face was bleeding freely now. "Counter-sniper neutralized," she whispered, her voice cracking with thirst. "Target 12. She wiped the blood from her eye with the back of her glove. The duel was over. But the war below was still raging. The silence that followed the death of the enemy sniper was brief. It was merely the intake of breath before a scream. Elena shifted her position slightly, grimacing as the sharp limestone dug into her bruised ribs. She checked the chamber of her SR-25. She was running low. She had not counted exactly, but the weight of the magazine told her she had less than 5 rounds left before she would need to reload. In a sustained firefight, 5 rounds was nothing. In her world, it had to be everything. Below, the enemy infantry had stopped their suicidal charges. They had realized that the direct approach was being punished by an invisible hand from the cliffs. Instead of pushing forward, they were pulling back, regrouping near a cluster of boulders on the far eastern flank. Elena traversed her scope to follow them. Through the swirling haze of the storm, she saw movement that made her blood run cold. 4 men were dragging a heavy tripod from the back of a technical truck that had been hidden in a ravine. They were setting it up with frantic urgency. It wasn't a machine gun. It was a recoilless rifle, an SPG-9, a weapon designed to punch through tank armor. Against the flesh and bone of the SEALs huddled behind a few rocks, it would be absolute devastation. "No," Elena whispered, her throat dry as sandpaper. They were loading a high-explosive round into the breach. Once that weapon fired, it wouldn't matter how many men she had shot. The overpressure alone would kill everyone in Bravo Team's perimeter, or bring the cliff face down on top of them. She checked the range. 800 meters. It was the outer limit of her effective range in these wind conditions. She looked at the men operating the weapon. If she shot the gunner, the loader would take his place. If she shot the loader, another would step in. She didn't have enough bullets to kill them all before they pulled the trigger. She needed to kill the weapon itself. Her eyes drifted to the side of the tripod. There, stacked carelessly on the ground, was a crate of ammunition. The lid was open, revealing the distinct olive-drab warheads of additional rockets. It was a small target. A box maybe 2 feet wide, 800 meters away, through a gale-force sandstorm. Elena closed her eyes for a second. She visualized the bullet's path. She felt the rotation of the earth, the drag of the air, the chaotic vector of the wind. She wasn't praying. She was calculating. She opened her eyes and exhaled, forcing her heart rate down to 40 beats per minute. 1 shot, she told herself. 1 kill. She aimed not at the men, but at the dark, metallic casing of the warheads in the box. She held high and left, fighting the urge to second-guess the wind call. The gunner on the SPG-9 was traversing the barrel. He was lining up on Miller's position. Elena squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked, the bolt locking back on an empty chamber. She didn't blink. She watched through the scope as the bullet cut through the air, a microscopic agent of destruction. For a second, nothing happened. Then the world turned white. The crate of ammunition detonated. The primary explosion triggered the loaded round in the SPG-9, creating a sympathetic detonation that tore the weapon and its crew apart in a catastrophic fireball. A massive plume of orange and black fire erupted from the ridge, expanding outward like a blooming flower of death. The shockwave rolled across the valley, shaking the cliff face under Elena's body. Even through the howling wind, The roar was deafening, a thunderclap that vibrated in her marrow. Down in the valley, the remaining enemy fighters froze. They looked at the burning crater where their heavy weapon had been. In the confusion of the storm, they didn't see a sniper shot. They saw an explosion big enough to be a Hellfire missile. "Air support!" She heard a voice scream over the enemy's unencrypted radio channel she had been monitoring. "The Americans have air support! Retreat!" Panic, contagious and overwhelming, swept through the enemy ranks. Convinced that an AC-130 or a drone fleet was circling above the clouds, they broke. They abandoned their positions, scrambling back into the deep ravines, fleeing from a phantom air force that existed only in the barrel of one young woman's rifle. Elena watched them run. She didn't fire again. She simply lowered her head onto the stock of her empty weapon, the heat from the barrel warming her cheek, and let the first shudder of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline crash was not a gradual decline. It was a cliff. One moment, Elena was a hyper-aware instrument of war, her senses tuned to the rotation of the earth and the velocity of wind. The next, she was just a 22-year-old woman lying on a cold rock, shaking uncontrollably. The explosion of the enemy ammunition cache had signaled the end of the engagement, but the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The storm was beginning to break, the magnetic interference lifting just enough for the static in her earpiece to resolve into a low, steady hiss. Elena rolled onto her back, staring up at the sky. The bruising yellow of the dust storm was fading into a dull, twilight gray. She tried to swallow, but her throat was parched, the tissues sticking together like dry parchment. Her canteen was in the rucksack she had abandoned at the bottom of the cliff. "Move," she commanded her legs. They felt like lead pipes, heavy and unresponsive. She forced herself up. The descent would be more dangerous than the climb. Her muscles were flooded with lactic acid, and her fine motor skills were degrading. She broke down her position methodically, picking up her spent brass casings. It was a sniper's habit, leave no trace. But it was also a way to ground herself in discipline. She slung the SR-25 across her chest this time, keeping the barrel pointed down. She needed her hands free for the treacherous slide down the goat path. The journey down took an eternity. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her shins. Twice her boot slipped on the shale, sending a cascade of rocks clattering into the void. She caught herself on raw, bleeding fingers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was not the graceful predator anymore. She was a survivor dragging herself out of the wreckage. As she reached the bottom of the scree slope, the visibility had improved to about 50 meters. She could see the dark shapes of the boulders where Bravo team had taken cover. She stopped. This was the most dangerous moment. A unit that had just been ambushed was a unit on a hair trigger. If she walked out of the gloom unannounced, a nervous operator might put 2 rounds in her chest before realizing she wasn't the enemy. She reached for her radio. "Bravo Actual, this is Echo," she croaked. Her voice was a wreck, barely audible. "Coming in from the west. Friendly. Do not fire." There was a pause, then a click. "Echo?" Miller's voice was unrecognizable, soft, stripped of its usual command bark. "Confirm visual. I am at the base of the cliff. Walking in." Elena stepped away from the wall. She emerged from the swirling dust like a ghost taking form. Her uniform was torn at the knees and elbows. Her face was a mask of gray dust, streaked with sweat and dried blood from the cut on her cheek. The oversized rifle looked massive against her small frame, a dark iron bar across her chest. She walked slowly, her boots dragging slightly in the sand. She didn't look at the ground. She kept her chin up, her eyes scanning the perimeter out of habit. 20 meters away, the SEALs of Bravo team began to stand up from behind their cover. They looked like statues coming to life. They were battered, covered in grime, bandages wrapped around limbs. Rodriguez, the heavy gunner who had mocked her height, lowered his weapon. His mouth hung slightly open as he watched her approach. Davis, the man who had offered to carry her gun, stared at her as if she were a creature from another planet. And there was Lieutenant Commander Miller. He was propped up against a rock, his leg heavily bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. He gripped his carbine, using it as a crutch to pull himself upright. He didn't speak. He just watched the green girl walk toward them. The silence in the wadi was absolute. The wind had died down to a whisper. Elena stopped 5 feet from Miller. She didn't salute. She didn't smile. She didn't ask if they were okay. She simply unslung her rifle, checking the safety one last time, and looked him in the eye. "Sector clear," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying the weight of 19 souls. Miller looked at the cliff behind her, then back at her. He looked at the blood on her hands. He realized, with a dawning horror and gratitude, that the thunder they had heard wasn't air support. It was her. She swayed slightly on her feet, the exhaustion finally catching up to her spine. "I need water," she whispered, the soldier facade cracking just enough to reveal the human underneath. The request hung in the air, simple and absolute. "I need water." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The men of Bravo team were still processing the cognitive dissonance of the last hour. They looked at the small, dust-caked figure standing before them, trying to reconcile the image of the green administrative burden they had mocked with the lethal force that had just dismantled an entire enemy platoon. Lieutenant Commander Miller broke the paralysis. He grunted, a sharp sound of pain, as he shifted his weight off his wounded leg. He didn't gesture to Davis or Rodriguez to help her. He didn't bark an order for a junior enlisted to fetch a canteen. With trembling hands, Miller reached down to his own belt. He unclipped his personal hydration pouch. The plastic cap stuck for a moment, gritty with sand, before twisting off with a dry crack. He limped forward. It was only 2 steps, but they were the most significant steps of the mission. He extended his arm, offering the flask to Elena. "Take it," Miller said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the arrogance that had defined their first meeting at the airfield. Elena looked at the flask, then up at his eyes. There was no pity in his gaze anymore. There was no condescension. There was only the hard, clear look of one warrior recognizing another. She accepted the water. Her hands were shaking now that the weapon was slung, the fine tremors of adrenaline withdrawal taking over. She lifted the flask to her cracked lips. The first mouthful was a shock to her system. The water was warm and tasted faintly of iodine and plastic, but to Elena, it was the sweetest thing she had ever consumed. It washed away the grit, the copper taste of blood, and the bitter residue of fear. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, cutting tracks through the layers of dust on her neck. When she lowered the flask, half empty, she found the rest of the team watching her. Davis, the point man who had offered to carry her rifle as a joke, stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and gently took the heavy SR-25 from her shoulder. He didn't take it to demean her. He took it to carry the load for a tired teammate. He slung it over his own shoulder, right next to his carbine, treating the weapon with a reverence he hadn't shown before. "Sit down, Echo," Davis said softly. Medevac is 10 mics out. We got the watch. Elena sank onto a flat rock, her legs finally giving out. She watched as Rodriguez moved to the center of the perimeter, popping a green smoke canister to mark the landing zone. The thick, vibrant smoke billowed up, a stark contrast to the dreary gray of the dying storm. "Command, this is Bravo Actual," Miller spoke into the handset, the signal finally clear. "LZ is hot but secure. We have 0 KIAs. Repeating, 0 KIAs. He paused, looking over at Elena, who was staring blankly at the smoke. "Casualty count is 4 walking wounded," Miller continued, "and 1 exhausted asset. We are coming home." The sound of rotors began to thump against the canyon walls, a rhythmic beating that grew louder with every second. The Pave Hawk helicopters were coming low and fast, skimming the valley floor. As the downwash of the approaching birds began to kick up a fresh cloud of sand, Miller hobbled over to where Elena sat. He didn't sit next to her. He stood guard over her. "Vause," he said, leaning down so only she could hear over the engine roar. Elena looked up, her eyes glassy with fatigue. "Sir?" "You disobeyed a direct order to retreat," Miller said. His face was stern, but the corners of his eyes were crinkled. "Yes, sir," Elena replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I did." Miller nodded slowly. He looked at the cliff face she had climbed, then back at hers. "Remind me never to give you an order like that again," he said. It was the closest thing to an apology she would ever get, and it was more than enough. The helicopter wheels touched down, the ramp lowering like a drawbridge. The team moved aboard, but this time they didn't rush past her. They waited. Davis signaled for her to go first. Elena stood up, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and walked toward the waiting bird. She wasn't walking behind them anymore. She was leading them home. The fluorescent lights of the debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Sand Viper hummed with a sterile, electric buzz that felt alien after the roaring acoustics of the canyon. The air conditioning was cold, chilling the sweat that had dried on their skins. Lieutenant Commander Miller sat at the head of the table. His leg was propped up on a chair, the bandage fresh and white against the grime of his uniform. Opposite him sat the base commander and an intelligence officer, their pens hovering over notepads. Elena sat at the back of the room, in the shadows, just as she had during the initial briefing. But this time, no one asked her to leave. "Let's review the engagement timeline," the commander said, looking at the preliminary report. "You were pinned down at 1400 hours. You reported heavy contact, effective enemy fire from 3 sides. Then, at 1445, you report all enemy hard targets neutralized and a disorderly retreat. That is a significant turnaround, Miller. Did air support finally get a drone through the storm?" Miller looked at the commander, then turned his head slowly to look at Elena. The bruise on his face was darkening, but his eyes were clear. "No, sir," Miller said, his voice steady. "No drones. No air. We were blind." "Then how do you explain the BDA? 12 confirmed kills, including a high-value commander, and the destruction of an SPG-9 nest. That's a platoon-level output." Miller tapped the table with his finger. "It wasn't a platoon, sir. It was a single asset." He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need to. Petty Officer Vause left the perimeter against my initial judgment. She climbed a Class 5 cliff face without ropes in a magnetic storm. She engaged 19 targets. She broke the ambush. Echo is the only reason Bravo team is sitting in this room and not in body bags. The commander looked at Elena. For the first time, he saw past the rank and the gender. He saw the stillness in her posture. "We will put this up for a commendation," the commander said, nodding. "A bronze star with valor, at minimum. Public affairs will want to hear about this. The sniper who saved the SEALs. It's a hell of a story." Elena stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. "With respect, sir," she said. Her voice was soft, but it held the tensile strength of steel wire. "I do not want the press." The room went silent. "I did my job," Elena continued, "just as the men of Bravo team did theirs. If you publish this, I become a novelty, a circus act. I just want to remain operational." Miller smiled. It was a small, tired smile. "She's right, sir. The best snipers are the ones you never hear about." Chucked. 2 hours later, the base was asleep. The wind outside had died down to a gentle breeze, shifting the sands that hid the secrets of the valley. In the overflow tent, Elena sat on the edge of her cot. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a yellow, lonely light. She had showered, scrubbing the desert from her skin, but the smell of cordite seemed to linger in her pores. On her lap lay the SR-25. She disassembled it with the care of a surgeon. Bolt carrier group, charging handle, firing pin. She dipped a rag in CLP oil and began to wipe down the carbon buildup. It was a ritual. It was a meditation. The metal was cold and honest. It didn't care if she was a woman. It didn't care if she was 12 or 22. It only cared if she was precise. The tent flap opened. Elena didn't look up. She was scrubbing the bolt lugs. Davis walked in. He was limping slightly. He stopped at the foot of her cot. He held a small patch in his hand. The Bravo team insignia, a skull with a trident. It was the morale patch from his own vest. He placed it on the table next to her gun oil. "We're going back out in 72 hours, Davis said. "Miller wants to know if you're available." Elena reassembled the rifle. Click, snap. She pulled the charging handle and released it, the bolt sliding home with a satisfying metallic slam. She looked up at Davis. Her eyes were dry, clear, and ancient. "I'm available," she said. Davis nodded. A single sharp nod of respect. He turned and walked out into the night. Elena Vause, the ghost of the valley, turned off the light. She lay back in the darkness, listening to the silence. She didn't need the applause. She had the mission, and for the silent hero, that was enough.